So far, so good. Let's add the next argument, which is the MAC address. Since, as you know, I am smart, I'm just going to press Ctrl+D here, which will duplicate this line for me. Now, all I have to do is change the options here. The next option I'm adding to my parser object allows the user to enter a new MAC address. So we're going to use M for the MAC, or they can use MAC to specify the MAC address. We'll store this under New MAC. In the Help section, we'll label this as New MAC Address. We've added this option in the same way we added the previous one. Since we're calling parser.parseArgs, we don't need to do anything else. If we run the help again, you'll see a new option, M or MAC. The help message for this option specifies that it's for entering the new MAC address. So far, everything is good. We're displaying the correct help message and accepting user input through arguments. However, we're still not using the values the user enters. Let's take another look at our code. First, we create an object that can handle user input via arguments. Then, we add options to this object. Finally, we use a method called parseArgs, which allows the object to interpret what the user has entered and handle it. This method returns the arguments and the values entered by the user if we assign it to a variable. In essence, it returns two sets of information, the arguments and the values. For example, let's say we run Python MacChanger, py, set the interface to LAN 0, and set the MAC to 001122334455. In this case, the arguments are interface and MAC, and the values are LAN 0 and 001122334455. When we call parser.parseArgs, it processes everything the user inputs and separates it into two sets of information, the arguments, like interface and MAC, and the values or options, like LAN 0 and the MAC address. To capture this information, we need to use variables. Since we're using two variables in one line, we use brackets and write options, arguments equals parser.parseArgs. This way, parseArgs functions as a method, not a regular function, which we'll discuss in more detail later. What's important to understand is that this method returns two sets of information, the arguments and the options. By using two variables, options and arguments, we capture this information. Note that we chose the names parser, options, and arguments for clarity, but you could use any names, like X, Y, and Z. However, meaningful names make programming easier and the code clearer. After this line, the options variable will contain the values, specifically LAN 0 and 001122334455. Meanwhile, the arguments variable will contain the arguments, interface, and MAC. Understanding this, you probably see that we won't actually use the arguments variable here, as it's not required for our code. What is useful to us is the options variable, as it contains the user-inputted values. To access the interface value, which is LAN 0, all we need to do is options.interface. The same applies to the MAC address. To access it, we use options.new MAC. To make our code more readable, we can set interface and new MAC equal to options, interface and options, new MAC respectively. That's it. Now, since interface and new MAC are already used in the code, there's nothing else we need to do. Let's go ahead and run the code. I've already entered the command, so we're running Python MacChanger, py, specifying the interface as LAN 0 and the MAC address. When we hit enter, you'll see that the print statement outputs the correct values. If we then run ifconfig LAN 0, you'll see that the MAC address has been reset to the one we specified. Now, let's try the program with the shorter arguments, I and M. We can run Python MacChanger, py, I to set the MAC address for eth0 and use M to set the new MAC. Press enter, and again, the print statement outputs correctly. If we check ifconfig eth0, you'll see the MAC address has been updated as expected. Our program is now pretty solid. It accepts user input through arguments, displays a help message, and allows the user to set both a MAC address and an interface directly from the command line, automatically executing the changes. In the future, we'll work with more modules, objects, and arguments, and everything we've covered so far will become even clearer.